Hello and welcome back to the Haunted Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to get comfortable, close your eyes, and let your mind drift. If you're enjoying these tales, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're listening from around the world. Now let the lights dim, the curtain rise, and may this story guide you into a deep, haunted sleep. The House That Waited. The mist hung heavy over the desolate town of Blackwood, shrouding its crumbling buildings in a suffocating veil. Streets that once echoed with the laughter of children and the hum of life now stood in eerie silence, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Among the ruins was a house that no one dared to enter, the Holloway Manor. The old mansion loomed atop a hill like a sentinel, its rotting wooden facade and shattered windows resembling a skull, a hollow gaze staring down upon Blackwood. The townsfolk spoke in hushed whispers of the curse that befell the Holloway family decades ago, a curse that no one dared to investigate further. But for Emma Larson, the manor was more than just a local legend. It was the last known residence of her older brother, Isaac, who vanished without a trace 5 years ago. Emma, now 28 and burdened by a relentless need for answers, returned to Blackwood with a single mission: to uncover the truth behind Isaac's disappearance. Emma parked her old sedan at the foot of the hill and stepped out into the cold, biting air. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a mournful, almost melodic sound, like a lullaby sung in a foreign tongue. Emma shivered and pulled her coat tighter around her. With a heavy breath, she began her ascent toward the mansion, the weight of her brother's memory pressing down on her with every step. As she approached the decaying structure, she noticed the door slightly ajar, creaking as the wind nudged it back and forth. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open, and the darkness within seemed to swallow her whole. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and rotting wood. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight as she stepped into the foyer. Faded portraits lined the walls, their eyes following her every move, as if the spirits of the Holloway family were still watching, still waiting. Isaac! Emma's voice echoed through the empty hall, a fragile sound that was quickly devoured by the silence. Only the wind answered, whistling through the broken windows, a haunting lullaby that seemed to echo the melody she'd heard outside. Emma's eyes fell on a staircase spiraling up into darkness. At the top, a door stood slightly ajar, a faint, flickering light spilling out from within. Heart pounding, she began to climb, each step heavier than the last. As she reached the landing, she pushed open the door and froze. The room was empty, save for a single rocking chair swaying back and forth, as if someone had just left it. And on the floor lay a photograph, yellowed and frayed, depicting the Holloway family. Emma's heart caught in her throat as she recognized the face of her brother standing among them, his eyes wide, his expression frozen in terror. From somewhere within the house, a voice echoed, a child's voice, singing that haunting lullaby. Emma dropped the photograph and turned toward the sound, her pulse quickening. Isaac! The voice grew louder, closer, the words clearer now. Sleep, my child. The night has come. The moon is watching. The stars are numb. Close your eyes and drift away, in the dark where spirits play. Emma's breath caught as she realized the voice was not coming from the hall. It was coming from the room she had just left. The rocking chair had stopped moving. and the photograph was gone. The air in Holloway Manor had grown colder, the chill seeping deep into Emma's bones as she stood frozen in place. Her mind raced, the unsettling feeling of being watched weighing heavily on her. Slowly, she stepped back into the room, the door creaking shut behind her with a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. She scanned the space, her eyes falling on the darkened corners where shadows clung like forgotten memories. The rocking chair had come to a complete stop, its once rhythmic movement now still, as though it had never moved at all. But the photograph, it was gone. The sense of loss was palpable, as though something had been taken from her, something important, something she couldn't yet understand. Emma felt a strange compulsion to sit down, to rest her weary legs, but she resisted. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. The song, the lullaby, still lingered in the air, curling around her like smoke, its melody almost hypnotic. She turned toward the window, trying to gather her thoughts, but what she saw made her stomach turn. Outside, the fog had thickened, rolling in like a slow-moving tide. The trees, now mere silhouettes against the pale light of the moon, seemed to sway in rhythm with the distant lullaby. It was as if the entire world had fallen into a trance, its heartbeat synchronized with the eerie tune that filled the manor. Something wasn't right. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she quickly moved to the door and stepped into the hallway. The temperature had dropped even further, and her breath came out in visible clouds, a stark contrast to the stillness of the house. She walked cautiously toward the staircase, her footsteps muffled by the thick dust on the floor. Each creak of the wooden steps beneath her feet seemed unnaturally loud, as if the house itself were protesting her presence. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, a faint noise caught her attention, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. A scratching, like fingernails dragging across the floor. Emma froze. The sound came from the direction of the basement. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to leave this place, but her feet were rooted to the floor. The memory of Isaac's disappearance surged in her chest, and with it, the desperate need for answers. What had happened to him? Why had he disappeared without a trace? And why had the townspeople remained silent for so long? With a final, resolute breath, Emma made her way toward the basement door, her pulse racing as the scratching grew louder. She reached for the handle, but the door creaked open on its own, as though inviting her inside. And just beyond the threshold, the darkness seemed to shift, like something moving within it. The basement door swung open with a groan, revealing a pitch-black void that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Emma hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up as the cold air in the basement pressed against her skin. Her breath came out in shallow gasps as she descended the worn, creaky steps, each one a reminder of how long it had been since anyone had ventured down here. The scratching sound had stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it felt suffocating. The darkness before her felt alive, pressing in on her from all sides, but Emma could sense that there was something just beyond it, something waiting for her, watching her. The smell of decay hit her next, an earthy, metallic odor that made her stomach churn. She forced herself to move deeper into the basement, her footfalls muffled by the thick layer of dust that coated everything. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, the faint outline of objects began to take shape. Old wooden crates, broken furniture, and stacks of newspapers yellowed with age. But there was something else, something far more unsettling. At the far end of the room, a faint glow flickered, like the dying embers of a fire. Emma's heart quickened. She didn't want to move closer, but she couldn't resist. The pull of whatever lay ahead was too strong. As she approached, the glow grew brighter, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And there, in the center of the basement, she saw it. A circle drawn in chalk on the floor, its edges frayed and fading. The symbol was unfamiliar, its jagged lines and curves twisting in unnatural ways, like a design meant to trap something. In the center of the circle was a pile of what appeared to be old books and scraps of paper, their contents unreadable in the dim light. But what caught Emma's attention the most was the figure seated cross-legged in the center of the circle. A man, his face obscured by dark, matted hair, hunched over in a way that seemed almost unnatural. His hands were pressed against his ears, his body trembling as though he were trying to shut out some invisible noise. Isaac. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward, unable to tear her eyes away from the figure. This was impossible. Her brother was supposed to have disappeared, vanished without a trace. But there he was, sitting in the circle, alive yet not quite alive. His eyes were wide open, but they lacked focus, as if he were trapped in a world far beyond the one she knew. "Isaac," Emma whispered, her voice trembling as she reached out to him. "Isaac, it's me. It's Emma. What's happened to you?" The man in the circle didn't respond. Instead, he began to rock back and forth, his hands still pressed tightly against his ears. And then, just as Emma was about to take another step toward him, she heard it. A sound, a low guttural hum, like a voice that was not quite human. It seemed to come from the very walls of the basement, vibrating through the floor and into her bones. Isaac's eyes flicked toward her, and for a brief moment, she saw a flicker of recognition, but it was quickly replaced by terror. "No," he rasped, his voice weak and strained. "You shouldn't be here. Don't listen to it. Don't." The hum grew louder, the walls seeming to pulse with the sound. Emma felt a cold wave of dread wash over her, her heart pounding in her chest as she stumbled backward. The basement, the house itself, seemed to close in on her, the air thick with an oppressive, suffocating weight. And then, in the blink of an eye, Isaac vanished. One moment, he was there, his trembling figure locked in place, and the next, he was gone, leaving nothing but the fading echo of his final words. Emma stood frozen, her breath shallow and uneven as she stared at the empty space where her brother had been moments before. The hum that had filled the air only moments ago had died away, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Her heart was racing, pounding so violently that it threatened to drown out her thoughts. "Isaac," she whispered, her voice trembling as she scanned the room, desperately searching for any sign of him. But there was nothing. The circle on the floor remained, its chalk lines dull and faded as though it had never held any meaning at all. The books and scraps of paper in the center were now scattered as if something had torn through them. The coldness of the basement seeped deeper into her skin, and with it, a creeping sense of unease. She took a tentative step backward, her feet heavy with the weight of fear. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, to leave this place and never return, but she couldn't. Not without answers. Not without knowing what had happened to Isaac. Her eyes lingered on the scattered papers. They were covered in strange symbols and handwriting that made no sense, gibberish as though someone had written in a frantic, disjointed script. The sight of them made her stomach churn, but she forced herself to crouch down and sift through the mess. One piece of paper, in particular, caught her eye. It was torn at the edges, stained with what looked like ink or something darker. As she turned it over, a name appeared in the center, scrawled hastily in uneven letters. The voice beneath. The words sent a shiver down her spine. She had heard the hum. The voice. Could it be connected to whatever had taken Isaac? Her hands trembled as she held the paper, unable to tear her gaze away from the strange writing. And then, as if answering her unspoken question, the air around her seemed to shift once more. A faint whisper, like a breath carried on the wind, brushed against her ear. "Leave now." The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice she had heard in the hallway, the one that sang the lullaby. Emma's heart lurched in her chest as she stood up abruptly, the paper slipping from her grasp. Her pulse quickened and she turned to face the stairs, but she didn't make it halfway. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light of the basement. It was tall, its features obscured by shadow, but the sense of familiarity was undeniable. Emma's breath hitched. It was Isaac, but it couldn't be. The Isaac she knew was gone, replaced by something else, something that was not quite him. "Isaac," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if the very air around her was swallowing her words. The figure did not move. It simply stood there, motionless, its head slightly tilted, as if it were observing her. Emma's hands clenched into fists, a mix of fear and confusion flooding her senses. She took a step toward the figure, but it did not respond. Instead, it raised its hand slowly, its fingers elongated and twisted in a way that made Emma's skin crawl. "No," she said, more forcefully this time, as she backed away. "You're not him. You're not my brother." The figure took a step forward, and Emma could see the faint outline of its eyes, empty, hollow voids, dark and endless. The sight made her stomach twist in horror. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the wooden floor as she dashed for the stairs. But the house seemed to stretch before her, the staircase impossibly distant. The figure followed, its footsteps silent, but Emma could feel it behind her, closing in. Her breath became ragged and panic surged within her as the stairs stretched farther and the basement door remained out of reach. With a final, desperate lunge, Emma reached for the door. Her fingers brushed the handle, but the door would not open. She pulled harder, her mind racing, her heart thundering in her chest. And then, with a sudden jolt, the door swung open. Emma stumbled through, the door slamming shut behind her with an ear-splitting crash. She collapsed against the wall, gasping for air, her body trembling uncontrollably. The house had fallen silent again, but she knew the figure was still there, somewhere in the shadows waiting. The silence in the house was deafening, a heavy stillness that pressed down on Emma like a suffocating weight. Her body was shaking uncontrollably, her mind racing with the horrors she had just witnessed. She pushed herself off the wall, her legs unsteady beneath her, but she couldn't bring herself to move from the spot. The door had shut behind her, and for the first time since entering Holloway Manor, Emma felt the faintest sense of relief. But it was short-lived. The oppressive presence that had followed her was still there, lingering, waiting, watching. She turned, her eyes darting around the hallway, searching for something, anything to reassure her that she wasn't trapped in some waking nightmare. But the house seemed unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. The same darkened windows, the same dilapidated walls, the same oppressive atmosphere. It was as though she hadn't just seen a figure from her brother's past or heard the whispers of a malevolent presence. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed through the house. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like a heartbeat. Emma froze, her eyes wide with fear. The sound seemed to be coming from above her, from the second floor. It was slow, deliberate, like the sound of footsteps dragging across the floor. With a shudder, she forced herself to move, her feet carrying her towards the staircase. She needed answers. She couldn't let fear dictate her actions. Not now. Not when she was so close. The tapping continued, growing louder as she ascended the stairs. With each step, the air seemed to grow heavier, the walls closing in on her. She reached the landing and looked around, but there was no sign of the figure. Still, she could feel it, the pressure, the weight, the sensation of being hunted. Her eyes fell upon the door at the end of the hallway. It was cracked open, a thin sliver of light spilling through. Her pulse quickened. She didn't know what she would find inside, but she had to see. She had to know what was happening to Isaac, what had happened to this place. She stepped forward, the floorboards creaking under her weight. As she reached for the doorknob, a gust of wind howled through the broken windows, sending a chill up her spine. But it was the sound that followed that made her blood run cold, a soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Come in." The voice. It was the same haunting lullaby she had heard in the basement. The same voice that had sung to her in the silence of the house. It beckoned her now, luring her into the darkness beyond the door. With a final, steadying breath, Emma pushed the door open. Inside, the room was bathed in an eerie, flickering light, the shadows dancing across the walls like ghosts. At the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface cracked and weathered by time. The reflection within was distorted, a warped image of the room that seemed to shift and ripple with every passing second. But it wasn't just the mirror that caught her attention. It was what was standing before it. Isaac, but not the Isaac she remembered. This version of him was pale, his skin almost translucent, as though he were fading away into the very air. His eyes were empty, hollow voids, dark and lifeless. His mouth moved, but the words that came out were not his own. The voice, the same one that had haunted Emma since she entered the house, echoed from his lips. "Come closer." Emma took a step forward, her heart hammering in her chest, but something stopped her. The air in the room felt thick, charged with a strange energy, as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling before her. The mirror's reflection warped once again, and she could swear she saw another figure standing just behind Isaac, a shadow, a presence that seemed to loom over him, its features indistinct. The figure in the mirror reached out, its hand grazing Isaac's shoulder. And with that touch, something shifted. Isaac's head snapped toward Emma, his eyes widening in terror. "Get out!" he screamed, his voice breaking through the lullaby. "Leave now. You can't stay here, it's too late." The room around Emma began to distort, the walls rippling like water. The air thickened and a low, guttural growl echoed from the corners of the room. The presence behind Isaac was moving closer, its form becoming more defined, a monstrous figure that seemed to materialize from the very shadows themselves. Without thinking, Emma turned and bolted from the room, her feet barely touching the floor as she ran back toward the staircase. She could hear the sound of something following her, something moving through the house with the speed and purpose of a predator. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to escape, but the house was closing in on her. The very walls seemed to shift, trapping her in an endless maze. And the growl was growing louder. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she fled down the hallway, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. The growl from behind her was relentless now, reverberating in the walls, each sound more guttural and bone-chilling than the last. It felt as though the house itself was alive, shifting, moving with an intelligence of its own, as if it were playing with her, toying with her fear. She reached the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under her weight as she descended. But the house had other plans. The once familiar staircase seemed to stretch before her, becoming impossibly long, each step heavier than the last. The sound of footsteps behind her, not her own, but something else, grew louder, faster. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled, her foot slipping on the worn stairs. She caught herself just in time, but when she looked up, her blood ran cold. At the foot of the stairs, standing in the doorway of the room where she had first seen Isaac's twisted reflection, was the figure. It was no longer just a shadow, now it was something more, something tangible. Its features were monstrous, a grotesque amalgamation of shapes and shadows, a silhouette that seemed to ripple and flicker like a broken image. The figure didn't move at first, but its eyes, or where eyes should have been, burned with a deep, malevolent light. Emma could feel the weight of its gaze, like it was boring into her very soul. "Leave, leave, leave." The voice came not from the figure, but from everywhere, reverberating through the house, twisting in her mind. Emma felt a pressure in her skull as though the sound was physically forcing its way in, scraping away her thoughts, making everything blur. She turned and ran again, her feet carrying her through the darkened hallways, but there was no escape. The house seemed endless, the rooms repeating themselves, the walls closing in around her with every corner she turned. A sudden crash behind her startled her, and she whirled around to see the figure moving toward her now. Its form had begun to solidify into something more recognizable, a man, tall and gaunt, with skin as pale as death. His hands were twisted, long fingers like claws that scraped along the walls, leaving deep gouges in the wood. Emma screamed, turning back to continue her frantic flight, but she knew the truth now. The house was not just an inanimate structure. It was part of whatever had taken Isaac, part of the curse that bound this place together. In the distance, Emma saw a glimmer of light. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it beckoned her. She ran towards it, her breath catching in her throat, the sound of the figure's pursuit growing louder with each step. She reached the end of the hallway where a small door stood slightly ajar. The light was coming from inside. Desperation gave her strength as she reached for the door handle. The moment her fingers brushed against it, she heard the growl again, closer than ever, followed by a voice, Isaac's voice, whispering through the crack in the door. "Don't open it." But Emma didn't hesitate. She wrenched the door open, stumbling into the room beyond. The light was blinding, but as her eyes adjusted, she realized where she was. The room was familiar, a small study with old bookshelves lining the walls, a single desk in the center. It was eerily pristine, as though time had not touched it. In the corner, a chair sat, and in that chair was Isaac, but this time there was something wrong. He was not alive. He sat slumped forward, his eyes wide open but unseeing. His mouth was frozen in a silent scream, and his skin was pallid, drained of life. And yet there was something different about him. The presence, the figure from before, loomed behind him, its form casting a long shadow that seemed to stretch across the room. Emma's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch her brother's face. His skin was cold, like marble, and as she touched him, the air in the room shifted. The figure spoke again, its voice like nails scraping across stone. "You should have never come." Emma's heart raced, and she pulled her hand back as if burned. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls warping as the shadows grew deeper, darker. The light flickered, and then it was gone. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the glowing eyes of the figure now standing directly behind Isaac's lifeless body. And then Emma felt it, something cold wrapping around her, like tendrils of darkness creeping into her very bones, pulling her toward the figure. It was an overwhelming sensation, one that crushed her will, suffocating her thoughts. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The darkness seemed to swallow Emma whole, its cold embrace wrapping around her like a shroud. Her vision blurred, the edges of the room distorting, twisting as though the very fabric of reality was tearing itself apart. She could feel the tendrils of shadow curling around her wrists, her ankles, dragging her closer to the figure. She fought against it, her body jerking in every direction, but it was futile. The more she struggled, the tighter the darkness gripped her, like invisible hands squeezing the life out of her. Her lungs burned as she gasped for air, but there was no oxygen, only the suffocating weight of the house pressing in on her chest. The figure was no longer just standing behind Isaac. It was leaning over him now, its grotesque face inches from her brother's, its lips curling into a twisted grin. The eyes, those empty, soulless voids, locked onto Emma, and for a moment, she thought she saw something there. A flicker, a glimmer of recognition. "Emma?" it whispered, the voice no longer a chorus but singular. personal, intimate. She tried to scream again, but her voice failed her. The darkness pulled her in closer, her body nearing the figure's outstretched hand. Its long fingers reached for her, and she could see them now, clawed, jagged nails, black as night. With a sudden, wrenching force, she was pulled to her knees, her hands scraping against the cold floor as the figure leaned closer, its mouth parting to speak. "You've seen too much. You've uncovered the truth. But the truth is always more than you can bear." Emma's mind raced, flashes of everything she had experienced in the house flooding her consciousness. The whispers, the figure, Isaac's transformation, it was all connected. But what was the truth? What was this thing, and why was it tormenting her? "Why Isaac?" she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why him? What do you want?" The figure didn't answer immediately. It tilted its head, as though considering her question with unnerving calmness. Then it spoke, its voice a slow, creeping murmur that seemed to echo in her mind rather than her ears. "The price of knowledge is always sacrifice." The words hit her like a physical blow, and her chest tightened with the weight of them. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and she forced herself to look away from the figure, her gaze falling back onto Isaac's body. She couldn't tell if he was alive or dead. His face was frozen in a grotesque mask of fear, but there was something about the stillness of his body that made her wonder if he had been taken entirely. And then it hit her. The voice, the whispers, the house itself. It wasn't just a haunted place. It was a vessel, a prison. Isaac hadn't just disappeared into the shadows. He had been claimed by whatever dark force ruled this place. "Isaac," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm sorry." A laugh, soft and cold, echoed in the room, and Emma's stomach turned. The figure pulled back slightly, allowing her a moment of clarity. "You should be. He was always meant for this. Just as you are, Emma." The figure's voice dropped to a whisper, its presence looming even closer. "You both have always been part of the plan. The curse is not just on this house, not just on your brother. It is on you as well." A sudden wave of nausea washed over Emma. She could feel her vision swimming as the room seemed to shift and pulse, the walls bending and groaning like the sound of a living creature in pain. "No," she whispered, tears threatening to spill. I won't become like him. I won't." The figure's form flickered for a moment, as though shifting between realities. It leaned in close again, and Emma could feel its cold breath against her skin. "You already are." The words were like ice, cutting deep into her. The house groaned again, the air thick with an unnatural pressure. The shadows around Emma seemed to close in tighter, encroaching on her vision until she could barely see anything but the glowing eyes of the figure. She felt herself being pulled, a magnetic force drawing her in, closer to the abyss, to the entity that had claimed Isaac. And then, in the distance, something changed. A soft light, faint but undeniable, flickered on the horizon of her mind. It was distant, almost too far to reach, but Emma focused on it, the image growing stronger with each passing second. She had to fight, had to find a way to break free. With a force of will she didn't know she still had, Emma twisted her body and shoved herself away from the figure. Her hands slid along the floor, the darkness slipping off of her like water, her skin tingling as though it had been burned. The figure's voice howled in fury as she broke free, its form losing coherence for a split second. Emma pushed herself to her feet, staggering, her vision swimming but her mind focused. She had to escape. There was a way out, and she was determined to find it. The light, it was real. It had to be. With renewed determination, Emma dashed for the door, ignoring the figure's scream of rage as it tried to follow. Her fingers brushed the door handle, and just as the figure's shadow stretched across the threshold, she yanked the door open and bolted into the hallway. The house was shifting again. The walls groaned, the floorboards cracked, but the light ahead of her, a soft, beckoning glow, remained constant. She ran toward it, her heart pounding, her breath ragged, her body exhausted. And as she reached the end of the hallway, she stepped into the light, and everything went dark. The silence that followed was deafening. It felt as though time itself had come to a standstill. Emma's eyes fluttered open, but there was nothing but a deep, unbroken blackness before her. No walls, no house, no figure. Only a vast emptiness that stretched out in all directions, suffocating and infinite. Her heart raced, her breath shallow. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy, like she was trapped beneath a great weight. She reached out into the dark, but her hands met nothing. No air, no resistance, just the void. Then, slowly, a faint, ethereal light began to grow far off in the distance. It was dim at first, like the glimmer of a star in the endless night, but it pulsed faintly as though it were alive. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She knew this light. It was the same one she had seen earlier, the one that had called to her, the one that had given her the strength to break free from the figure. But this time, there was no door. There were no walls. Just the light pulling her in. She hesitated, fear creeping up her spine. Was it the same light, or had it changed? Was this some new trick, some part of the house trying to lure her back in? But then she remembered Isaac, his lifeless eyes, the figure that had claimed him. She couldn't let that be her fate. She couldn't let it take her too. With trembling legs, she began to walk toward the light. Each step felt like it took an eternity, her body heavy, her mind dizzy, as though the darkness itself were trying to drag her back. But she refused to stop. She had to reach it. As she drew closer, the light intensified, filling the void with its warm, golden glow. She could see shapes now, faint outlines forming in the distance. She wasn't alone. Figures appeared before her, shifting in and out of focus, their features indistinct but unmistakably human. Some were standing, some crouched, others sprawled on the ground as though they had fallen. Each of them seemed frozen in time, caught in their own personal struggle, their faces contorted in pain or fear. Emma's heart skipped a beat. These were not strangers. They were familiar. Isaac's face emerged from the swirling shadows. His eyes were wide, unblinking, his expression empty, but there was something different now, a faint glimmer of recognition. As if, in some way, he could see her too. She reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to touch his, but the space between them stretched impossibly wide. She couldn't get any closer. She could hear him, though, his voice faint but clear in the emptiness. "Emma!" Her heart clenched in her chest. The voice was so weak, so distant, but it was unmistakable. It was Isaac. "Isaac," she cried out, her voice breaking. "What happened? Where are we?" But there was no response. The space around them seemed to throb with an unbearable pressure, and the light flickered like it was losing its strength. The figures around her shifted again, their forms growing more distorted, like reflections in a broken mirror. They moved closer, their shapes blurring and overlapping, until Emma could barely tell where one figure ended and another began. Suddenly, a dark shape appeared at the edge of the light, a figure far larger than the others, its form stretching out in unnatural proportions. It was the figure from the house, the one that had haunted her. the one that had consumed Isaac. It stepped forward, its twisted limbs reaching out like skeletal arms, and Emma's heart pounded in her chest as it moved closer. Her legs froze as if her body refused to carry her any further. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. The figure's eyes burned with an unholy intensity, glowing in the darkness like twin embers. "You cannot escape," the figure whispered, its voice a harsh rasp scratching at her mind. "You belong here now. You always have." Emma struggled against the pressure, but the light seemed to flicker again, the warmth it had once offered turning cold, its glow dimming. She could feel her connection to it slipping away as if the light was being swallowed up by the darkness. "You cannot save him," the figure said again, its voice louder, more insistent. "He is mine." Emma's stomach twisted in horror. No, she wouldn't accept that. She wouldn't let it happen. With every ounce of strength she had left, she tore herself away from the figure's gaze, her eyes darting around the swirling mass of faces. She couldn't lose him, not now, not like this. She closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to concentrate. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to save Isaac. She couldn't let this thing win. Then a thought broke through the fog of fear that had consumed her. It wasn't just the light she had been following. It was a symbol, a way out, a path. She had seen it before, felt it. The key to escaping this place, the key to saving Isaac, was not in running. It was in breaking the cycle, in defying the thing that held them here. When she opened her eyes again, the figures were all gone. The space around her was empty, save for the dark, looming presence of the figure, its eyes still fixed on her. And for the first time, Emma understood. Emma's realization hit her like a storm. It wasn't the figure that controlled the light or the darkness or the space they were trapped in. It was something much more subtle, much more insidious. It was the cycle. She had been repeating the same mistakes, running away from the truth, hoping for an escape, but all the while, the darkness had been manipulating her choices. It fed on her fear, on her desperation, twisting her actions into futile attempts to break free. The key was not to fight the darkness, but to accept it, to face it head-on, to confront the part of herself that had been running from the truth for so long. Her gaze shifted back to Isaac. His face was still there, hovering in the dark space, his eyes wide and unblinking. But now there was something different in his expression, a flicker of recognition, of understanding. He too had been trapped in the cycle just as she had. He had been lost, consumed by the darkness, but now his form seemed to waver, as though he were starting to come to terms with the truth of his existence here. Emma took a slow step forward. The pressure in the air intensified, but this time she didn't recoil. She embraced it, allowing herself to feel the weight of the darkness, the presence of the figure, and the truth that it had been hiding from her all along. "You're not lost," she whispered to Isaac, her voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. "We can break this. We can stop running." The figure let out a low growl, its form rippling with dark energy. "You cannot change what is already written. You cannot escape your fate." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. It was true in a sense. They were bound to this place, to this cycle. But that didn't mean they were powerless. The figure, the darkness, the house, they were all part of the same thing. And that meant they were all vulnerable to the same truth. Isaac's face twisted in a grimace, and for a moment, it looked as though he might disappear into the darkness again. But then, his eyes locked onto hers, and a spark of recognition flared in them. He wasn't lost. Not anymore. Emma took another step forward, her voice stronger now. "We can change this. Together." The figure's form began to unravel, its shape flickering in and out of existence, as though it was struggling to hold itself together. The more Emma spoke, the more the figure's presence weakened, its power eroding under the weight of her words. Isaac's form grew clearer, his body materializing in front of her. His face still pale but no longer blank. He was looking at her, really looking at her, and for the first time since they'd entered this place, she could see a hint of recognition in his eyes. "Emma," Isaac said, his voice hoarse, strained. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." The words sent a jolt through Emma's chest, a sharp pang of emotion. She reached out to him, her hand trembling, and for a moment, it seemed as though the distance between them might finally shrink. "You didn't know what?" she whispered, the words barely leaving her lips. Isaac looked down, his expression pained. "I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to break free from it. It's been with me for so long. The house, the whispers, the figure." He looked up at her again, his eyes full of guilt. "I thought if I just kept quiet, if I just stayed out of it, it would leave me alone." Emma felt the coldness of his words settle into her chest, but she didn't pull away. "It's not your fault, Isaac. We both were trapped here, running from something we didn't understand. But we can stop running now." The figure's form was nearly gone now, its presence slipping away like smoke, fading into the nothingness from which it had come. It howled in frustration, but Emma stood firm, her hand reaching for Isaac. She closed her eyes for a moment, focusing on the truth. The one truth that had eluded her for so long. The darkness wasn't just in the house. It was in them too. It had been feeding on their fear, their guilt, their regret. But now they were no longer afraid. They had found the light within themselves, the light that had always been there, hidden beneath the fear. The darkness began to dissipate, like fog being blown away by a strong wind. Emma felt the weight lift from her shoulders, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. She opened her eyes again, and the empty space around her was gone. The figures, the shadows, the twisting walls, all of it had faded away, leaving only calm, quiet stillness. Isaac was standing beside her now, his hand in hers. They were no longer alone, no longer lost in the void. "Is it over?" Isaac asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emma nodded, her gaze fixed on the quiet space around them. "I think it is." And then, as if in response to her words, the space began to change. The emptiness shifted, twisting, and the light that had once felt distant and unreachable now grew brighter, more real. The house, their house, appeared before them, standing tall and solid. The walls were no longer broken, the windows no longer shattered. It was as it should have been. They were home, but even as the house restored itself, Emma knew that things would never be the same. The darkness that had haunted them, that had fed on their fear and guilt, was gone. But the memories remained, and those memories, though painful, would be the key to ensuring they never fell back into the cycle. Together they had broken free, and together they would rebuild. The light from the restored house flickered softly like a candle gently swaying in the breeze. The air felt crisp, clean, not heavy, not suffocating. But beneath that sense of relief, Emma still felt the weight of everything that had happened, like a shadow lingering just out of sight, waiting for the moment she would let her guard down. She turned to Isaac, searching his face for any sign of the same lingering doubt, the same fear that still clawed at her insides. But he was different now, calmer, more present. The look in his eyes no longer reflected the emptiness from before, the same hollow stare that had haunted him when they first arrived. He was grounded, his gaze steady and determined. "We did it," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She still couldn't quite believe it. After everything, the house, the darkness, the figure that had seemed so invincible, it was over. Isaac nodded slowly, his lips curling into a faint smile. "I think we did." They both turned toward the house as it solidified before them, its wooden frame strong once again, the windows no longer shattered, the doors standing open as if inviting them back inside. The house had once been a prison, a place of torment and fear, but now it felt like a refuge, a place where they could begin anew. Emma took a step forward, her heart pounding. There was a strange calmness in the air, as if the house was waiting, listening. She could feel its pulse, like the steady beat of a heart alive with the promise of something better. "Are we really free?" she asked, her voice barely more than a murmur. Isaac stepped beside her, his hand brushing hers. "I think we are, but I don't think we're meant to forget. We can't forget what happened. Not completely." Emma nodded. It wasn't the kind of freedom that came without scars. The past, the darkness, had left its mark on them, on their minds, their souls. But that didn't mean they couldn't move forward. It didn't mean they couldn't heal. They stepped into the house together, the door creaking softly as they crossed its threshold. The interior was different now, familiar yet strange, as if the house itself had transformed. The rooms were warm, inviting, though they held traces of the old shadows. The walls were lined with photographs, faces smiling back at them, but some of those faces looked different now. They had changed, grown older, or perhaps they had simply learned to see the world through a different lens. The staircase before them loomed tall, the steps familiar, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows, something waiting. She glanced over at Isaac, but he seemed to sense it too. His expression grew more serious, and he stepped forward, leading the way up the stairs. The house was alive, and it wasn't just alive with memories. It was alive with something else, something older. Something that had always been here, lurking in the corners, waiting for the right moment to resurface. At the top of the stairs, they reached a hallway lined with doors, each one closed, each one hiding its own secret. Emma hesitated, her fingers hovering over the handle of the nearest door. The house felt heavy again, as though it were holding its breath. "What's behind this one?" she whispered, her hand trembling slightly. Isaac paused beside her, his eyes scanning the hallway. "I don't know, but I think it's time to find out." With a deep breath, he turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, almost cramped, with a single window overlooking the now restored landscape. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books, their spines worn as though they had been read many times. In the center of the room, a large chair sat in front of a desk, papers scattered across it. But it wasn't the books or the desk. Emma's mind raced, her heart hammering in her chest as the weight of the realization settled in. The papers on the desk, the painting, they weren't just remnants of a past life. They were a part of her, pieces of her journey scattered across time and space, waiting for her to put them together. "What is this place?" she whispered, the question hanging in the air, unanswered. Isaac looked at the papers with concern, but there was something in his eyes that told her he wasn't entirely shocked. He seemed to recognize the significance of the moment, the weight of the discovery. "I think," he said slowly, "this house has always been tied to you, Emma. To us. It's not just a place we happen to find. It's part of us. Maybe we're part of it." Her mind spun as she traced her fingers over the words on the paper. The more she looked, the more they seemed to blur together, forming patterns that felt familiar but impossible to place. She had seen these notes before, somewhere. In her nightmares, in the deepest recesses of her mind, these same scribbles had danced in the corners of her consciousness, taunting her with their meaning. The name on the paper, her name, was just the beginning. The figure, Emma murmured more to herself than to Isaac. It's been watching us. It's been guiding us here. But it's not just the house. It's us too. Isaac stepped closer, his eyes widening as he tried to understand. You mean the darkness? It's been using us all along. She nodded slowly. It's more than just a force of evil. It's a part of something older, something connected to this place. And it's been shaping us, shaping this reality all along. The room seemed to grow colder as she spoke, the shadows stretching longer, creeping up the walls like living things. Emma felt a chill run down her spine, but she couldn't look away from the papers. She was so close now, so close to understanding what had been happening to her. A sudden sound, a soft thud, interrupted her thoughts. She turned quickly, her pulse quickening. The door to the room had slammed shut behind them. Isaac stepped back, his eyes wide with alarm. What was that? I don't know, Emma whispered, her voice trembling. The air had changed. The calm, quiet stillness of the house had disappeared, replaced by a thick, oppressive weight. It felt like they were being watched again, the familiar presence of the figure returning, lurking in the corners. Suddenly, the lights flickered. A low hum filled the room, vibrating the air around them. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The figure was here again, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. She could feel it pressing in on her, urging her to run, to escape, to give in to the fear. But Emma didn't run. She couldn't. Not this time. I know what we need to do, she said, her voice steady now, stronger than she had ever felt. We have to face it. The house, the figure, the darkness, it's all part of the same thing. We can't escape it. We have to confront it. Head on. Isaac looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. Are you sure? What if we're not strong enough? What if it consumes us? Emma looked back at the papers, the scribbles that seemed to pulse with their own energy. The name on them, her name, the connection between her and the house, it was all too clear now. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for identity, for control. The figure had been trying to consume them, to erase their existence, to keep them trapped in this cycle forever. But Emma wasn't going to let that happen. Not anymore. We are stronger than it thinks, she said, her voice unwavering. We have the power to break this, to end it. With that, she turned toward the door, stepping boldly toward the threshold. Isaac hesitated, then followed her, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. They crossed the threshold of the room and stood once again in the hallway facing the darkened staircase. The figure's presence loomed over them, an oppressive weight that seemed to stretch beyond the house, beyond time itself. It was everywhere, in the walls, the air, the very ground beneath their feet. But Emma felt something shift inside her. The darkness that had once consumed her was no longer the dominant force. She could feel it waning, its power slipping through her fingers as she took control, as she embraced the light within her. Isaac stood beside her, his hand once again brushing hers. Together, they moved down the hall toward the staircase. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows stretching like fingers reaching for them. The figure was waiting at the top, its presence unmistakable, but Emma could feel the balance of power shifting. This time, they weren't running. This time, they were ready. At the top of the stairs, the darkness surged toward them, an overwhelming wave of cold and shadow. But Emma didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her hand raised, her voice steady as she spoke the words that had been building inside her for so long. You are not in control, she said, her voice filled with authority. We are. The figure recoiled, its form flickering and distorting as though it couldn't maintain its shape. Emma's words were like a dagger to its core, a disruption in the cycle it had tried so desperately to maintain. Isaac stood beside her, his presence solid, his hand gripping hers tightly. Together, they stood against the figure, against the darkness, against everything that had tried to consume them. And as the figure howled in defeat, Emma could feel it, the breaking of the cycle, the unraveling of the force that had trapped them for so long. The house trembled, and for the first time in ages, the light in the room didn't flicker. It shone brightly, casting away the shadows, casting away the fear. The figure was gone. The house was theirs once again. Emma stood there, her heart pounding, staring at the now empty space where the figure had been. The house was eerily silent. For the first time since they arrived, there were no whispers in the walls, no shifting shadows, no presence lurking in the dark corners. "We did it," Isaac said softly, but there was no joy in his voice, only a quiet disbelief. Emma didn't respond immediately. She was too absorbed in the sudden stillness, the feeling of the house settling around them. The air was thick with the weight of what had just happened. It was as though the house itself had exhaled after being held in some unnatural state for far too long. "We should leave," she said finally, her voice carrying a hint of urgency. Isaac nodded, but there was hesitation in his eyes. "Are we truly free? Or is this just another illusion?" Emma's gaze drifted toward the window. Outside, the landscape seemed almost too perfect, too serene. The storm clouds had parted, the sky cleared, and the moonlight bathed the world in a pale glow. It almost felt like nothing had ever happened, like they had never been trapped in this nightmare. "We're free," Emma said firmly, though part of her wondered if she truly believed it. "But we need to leave now. We can't let the house keep us here any longer." Isaac hesitated, but then gave a reluctant nod. Together, they walked out of the room, back into the hallway where they both had once felt so lost. The staircase stretched before them, each step a reminder of how far they had come. As they descended, the sound of their footsteps was the only noise that filled the air. The tension between them was palpable, but Emma knew they had to push forward. The house was no longer a place of torment, but it was still a place full of memories. And memories had a way of following you, no matter where you went. They reached the front door, which now stood open. It beckoned them, the fresh night air beyond seeming to promise freedom. They didn't speak as they stepped outside, the cool wind brushing against their faces. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. The scent of the earth, the smell of something new, of something alive, washed over her. They had made it. It was over. And yet, as they stood there, on the threshold of the house they had so desperately fought to escape, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was still waiting. A quiet voice in the back of her mind whispered, "What if it never truly ends?" But she pushed the thought aside, determined not to let it consume her. She was free. They were both free. It was time to leave. Together, they turned away from the house and walked into the night, the moonlight guiding their path as they left the past behind.